Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming. My name is Julie Miles, and I am the Associate Producer of the Meighen Forum. As we speak, the Amazon rainforest is ablaze, and the world and its leaders are watching. The earth is calling out for help, and I want to acknowledge the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe, and the Neutrals for being the past, present, and future caretakers of this land we stand on today. This land feeds us, shelters us, and provides space for our children to play and for us to gather, and it's on all of us to think about caring for it for the generations to come. Today is our final installment of CBC Ideas' 5-part series titled The Disruptors, that explores the roots of modern identity through the ideas of 5 people who flipped the table of conventional thought. The disruptor today is not a new personality. Shakespeare had him pegged 500 years ago. He has been compared to Iago with his manipulative lies and deceit, as well as he's been compared to the conceited, self-absorbed Falstaff, who is oblivious to the mockery that surrounds him. Yes, today we are talking about a leader who proclaims to be the chosen one, Donald Trump. Today's event is being live streamed, so I'd like to welcome our virtual audience around the world. We are so very pleased that you can join us today. We will begin with introductions of our guests and a moderated discussion, and of course, leaving some time for some questions from you. Our ushers have distributed note cards here in the studio theater, so jot down a question and we will collect them in a timely manner. For those on our live stream on our Facebook page, just pose a question in the feed on the side, and one of our staff members will get the question to our moderator. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you today the host of CBC Ideas and our moderator today, Nahlah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. Just so you know, it's a full house. We have an overflow room as well, and people are watching on the live stream, which indicates the interest continues. And as you know, today's discussion is titled Trump and After, and it is the 5th and last of a series about people who were game changers and whose impact on our modern world has been profound. So people like Darwin, Marx, Freud, and Einstein. Now, 2 of those have largely been discredited. So not all game changers are necessarily always correct in their ideas, but their influence is still profound. And perhaps that's where Donald Trump comes in. So today we'll be looking at Trump's influence and the potential long-term impact he and his presidency might have on the world. And of course, as you all know as consumers of the media, that he has had a profound impact in geopolitics, his attitude to other nations, both friends and enemies, on social issues, his attitudes to women in politics, and the way he seems to also be a party of one. Now, with us to discuss all this are Linda McQuaig, is a Canadian journalist, social critic, and sometime candidate for political office. She's the author of many books examining issues in democracy and free market economics, the winner of a National Newspaper Award, and a columnist for the Toronto Star. The National Post called Linda McQuaig Canada's Michael Moore, and her recent book is The Sport and Prey of Capitalists. David Frum is a senior editor at the Atlantic magazine. He started his journalism career here in Canada at Saturday Night magazine, and he's written for the Wall Street Journal, Forbes magazine, and the Weekly Standard, the National Post, as well as many others. His interest in politics led him to the White House, where he was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, and later a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. The author, again, also of many books on politics, and a self-described conservative Republican who says that in 2016 he voted for Hillary Clinton. Bob Rae, of course, no stranger to any of you, has had a long career in Canadian politics. He was Premier of Ontario in the 1990s and later went on to federal politics as a Toronto MP, eventually becoming interim leader of the Liberal Party, after Michael Ignatieff and before Justin Trudeau. A lifelong champion of social justice, he's worked as a lawyer representing First Nations in political negotiations. He's been Canada's special envoy most recently to Myanmar and advisor to the Prime Minister on the Rohingya crisis. Please welcome our panel. Now, the natural place, of course, to start is politics, and we can at least talk about at least 2 distinct areas here. One would be the White House, the president's office, and the other is party politics in the United States. And so, David, I wanted to start with you. Beyond the day-to-day, what are the new hallmarks that you could point to of party politics in the United States that have come directly as a result of the Trump effect?
Thank you very much. Well, first, I would like to thank you for your hospitality in Stratford. I hope everyone attending is having a splendid weekend and no one is too downcast by the commotion in the stock markets this weekend. It's all, as they say, it's all fun and games until someone loses $600 billion in wealth in 6 hours. I think one of the most dramatic ways of understanding what's happening to party politics is to look not at the United States, but at the United Kingdom. In 2016, in the referendum over Brexit, if you look constituency by constituency, who voted for and who voted against, of the 25 constituencies that were most pro-Brexit, 20 were held by the Labour Party. And of the 25 constituencies that were most anti-Brexit, 20 were held by the Labour Party. We have built since the war, and maybe even before the war, a party system that is based on issues about private versus public sector, the role of government in the economy, redistribution. We've moved into a new era where those issues are less salient than new issues of ethnicity, identity, belonging. And the party map is being scrambled. Canada is maybe less affected by these developments than other democracies, but just about everywhere across the developed world, we see the shrinkage of traditional social democratic parties, the rise of these new authoritarian populist parties that draw votes in different ways. And that is what has been going on in the United States. I mean, what you're watching there is the withering of the Republican Party, as I knew it as a young person. When Ronald Reagan was president, about a third of Americans identified as Republicans. Today, barely more than a fifth do. The Democratic Party has also shrunk, but not so fast. And we are watching the remaking of the map. And I think you will see in 2020 some very unusual things happening. States that used to be solid Democratic states, like West Virginia, becoming the most Republican state or among the most Republican states in the Union. The Republican hold on places like Tennessee and Georgia weakening as voters in knowledge centers like Nashville and Atlanta increasingly outnumber those in hinterlands.
So notwithstanding, of course, it's a big one notwithstanding, but given that there were so many other factors, I'd like to hone in on where Trump actually comes in. And I wondered, Linda, if you could maybe tackle that. What's his effect on all of this?
Well, first of all, let me just say I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much. I guess I was brought in as when Steve Bannon couldn't make it, but but let me just say, you know, I agree with a lot of what David's saying. We're seeing real evolution in politics. He talks about the rise of the sort of immigrant baiting, I mean, let's face it, some racism there. I don't know that we're seeing the end of the dominance of the issues of inequality, redistribution, all that in politics. In other words, and we see this particularly in the Trump phenomena, you know, the focus is very much on, you know, inciting hatred, really, towards so many different groups, particularly brown-skinned groups. But in fact, what's really going on, too, of course, is these enormous tax cuts for the very rich. And that is, in fact, let's say, what the influence of the Koch brothers has brought about. Fundamentally transformed the Republican Party, you know, pumped billions, they're billionaires, pumped billions, and, you know, remade it in the name of libertarian extremist right-wing politics that's all about, you know, deregulating corporate power, or deregulating rules on corporations, bigger tax cuts for the rich. So yes, Trump has tapped into this anti-immigrant strain, but what we're really still about in American politics is that huge power of the corporate elite.
Mm-hmm. But Bob, Trump started as an outsider. I mean, there were many Republicans that did not, and perhaps may not, still want him to be president. What is it about him in particular that helped him, you think, take over and essentially recreate the party in his own image?
I think it's his hair, more than anything.
The mystery solved.
Sorry, you know, I think of Darwin, Marx, Freud, Einstein, and Trump. And I'm reminded of that old Sesame Street song about which one of these is not like the other. You know? But seriously, I think, and you have to, first of all, I think laughter is a huge factor in how we survive politics these days. But I think that Trump has appealed to a new constituency of people who have actually been dispossessed by changes in the economy. David talked about West Virginia. Well, West Virginia has not benefited to the same extent as many other centers in the United States from the age of globalization and the transformation of the American economy, Canadian economy. So there are the whole world of who is a have and who is a have-not has changed, and is changing all the time. And Trump was able to develop a way of connecting with a whole group of people who were angry and who were left out and who felt that the world was changing around them and they had no control over it. And this actually, I think, is the feedbed of populist nationalism. It comes from, it's not about does it really come from identity or does it really come from economic anxiety. Academics and journalists can debate this forever, but in reality, it's both. Both are playing a big role in this transformation. And that economic change and the social changes as well are also creating the polarization and changing the nature of party coalitions. And I think we can see this not only in the United States, but across Europe and in Canada too, in many, many different countries. These are the factors that underlie it. And Trump's undeniable skills as a communicator, and as, you know, in a way, Twitter is the perfect medium for him because it's a medium that allows him to speak directly and doesn't require him to talk in complete sentences, and also allows him to be as impulsive as he wants to be because, as somebody who uses Twitter and who occasionally has to be warned, I'm not sure you should be sending that out, but usually too late. It's an institution of impulse. It's about impulsive thinking rather than consequential thinking. And I think a lot of problems that people who are critics of Trump from all parts of the political spectrum are saying, are you really thinking about the consequences of what you're doing and saying? And frankly, he doesn't care, because his full intention is to continue to build his base. He doesn't govern in the name of all the people. He governs in the name of a political base. And we see that tendency in a lot of different parties at different times. And when it takes over, it's always a dangerous thing.
Now, you mentioned Twitter, and that's a great departure point for talking about the White House. And David, you were there 2 presidents ago. Could you speak to some of the checks and balances, I guess, for lack of a better description, that around the president, what he can and what he can't do, and how that's changed since the time you were there?
Well, first let me reassure Bob Ray, as someone who also uses Twitter, that you just have to make the transition from politician to journalist, because once you're a journalist, you never regret anything. As Michael Kinsley, a great journalist of and editors, used to say, if you're not, as a journalist, if you're not afraid you've gone too far, then you haven't gone far enough. The White House is a whole system of checks and balances. There's the White House, and then there's the executive branch. What is broken around Trump is the most important check on the presidency is Congress, not the courts. The courts are slow. The courts can only take cognizance of disputes that are brought before them, and many disputes are none of the court's business. And so they can say, even though we think something bad has happened here, it's not a legal matter. So, the political branches have to sort it out. So when the oversight of Congress fails, or when the oversight of Congress is systematically defeated, one of the things that makes Trump different from past presidents is an idea would come up. Well, what if we do this? Well, you say, well, the chairman of this committee or that committee won't like it, and that's a problem. So Trump consistently says, so, Well, then there'd be a vote of the whole House condemning you. So? Well, then Congress might get very, very upset. So? Well, I guess so nothing. So he pushes it. So those are the restraints that have broken. And Trump operates, because the Republican Party is such a shriveled thing, he has constraint. Linda made a point that I think is a very helpful jumping off point to understand what's happening. The Republican Party is both, it's an entity in transition. They're the backward-looking parts, and they're the forward-looking parts. The backward-looking parts are indeed the parts that Linda talked about, the parts that are very beholden to big donors, of which the Koch brothers are just one example, very concerned with business interests and corporate interests, very determined to deregulate and to cut taxes. And then there's the forward-looking part, the part that looks more toward the authoritarian populist parties of Europe, that looks more toward Brexit. And Donald Trump represents that. Donald Trump his gift is his ability to do all the things that Bob Ray said, but his defect is he cannot understand why he is successful. And so he continually appeases the backward-looking parts of the party, and that's why he's in so much trouble. Imagine right now if Donald Trump had listened not to Jared Kushner's advice, but to Steve Bannon's advice. Imagine if he hadn't done the giant tax cut. Imagine if he had spent that money instead on road paving projects all over the United States. And now imagine that he were in this trade war with China. Trump used his $1 trillion of fiscal room to buy the votes of people who are going to vote for him anyway. He could have used that same $1 trillion, which even in the United States is a lot of money, could have used that same $1 trillion, that's the deficit this coming year, to buy the votes of the people who might not have voted for him, like the farmers, like the others, and said, I'm going to do this trade conflict with China, and it's going to hit, yes, some people who are not going to vote for me are going to lose hundreds of billions of dollars, but the people who might, you will get something. He never quite understood what he was speaking to. But what he did understand, and this is why he was successful in 2016, and this is the thing that his White House has not been able to deliver to him. He campaigned in 2016 as truly a different kind of Republican. He said, I am not going to cut Social Security. I am going to put more money, not less, into health care. I am not going to do a giant tax cut. I will rebuild the roads. And what I will do is I will uphold the social welfare system. And this is the thing that all these authoritarian populist parties have in common, that we inherited from the 50s and 60s. And I will preserve it for the children of the people of the 50s and 60s. And all these newcomers, we are going to forget about them. We are going to preserve the social security system for the well-established, for the so-called deserving, and remove it from the undeserving. And the deserving people, or the people who are identified as deserving, say that sounds like a very attractive notion. The National Front in France, the Alternative for Germany, these are pro-welfare state parties. They are not like the old parties of the center-right. And that's what Donald Trump was inching toward. And if he loses in 2020, it's because he failed to understand his own success. And the question for the future is what happens if there is a future Donald Trump who is more analytic, with more understanding of his success, a clearer vision for the future, and a real work ethic, which Donald Trump did not have.
I wonder just if I could follow up on that with you. You know, when you watch the pronouncements and what comes from the White House, the one question that you're left with is there an overarching sort of political philosophy behind him? Like, is there a coherence to what he's presenting to the world, or is it as random as it seems?
No, he's just in the grip of narcissistic personality disorder. And as somebody had a very good line on Twitter the other day, that we all try to understand what chess game Donald Trump is playing, but in reality his staff are trying to stop him from eating the pieces.
Good line, good line.
He's not, this is where he's unlike, to answer Bob Ray's, he's unlike, he is not a driver of events. He is riding events. He's got that an intuitive feeling for the events, and he was able to ride them. But he, I think, will end up being destroyed by them because he didn't understand them well enough to master them.
I think that's correct. And I think that what's interesting is I anticipate he's going to go down to defeat in 2020.
So,
I don't know.
so tell us why.
We can get into debate about that. But my point is, when he's finished, and he will be finished at some point, you know, I think what we're left with then is, what will the Republican Party be like? because I think that it seems that he's got a kind of cult-like power over all kinds of people. Not the majority of Americans, but you know, he seems to be able to hold people in a trance almost, despite his incredibly foolish, incoherent policies and ideas and things he says. But and once he loses, I think those people will probably go somewhere else. And I guess my concern, I mean, I think there's all kinds of incredibly important existential problems the world faces that the US plays such an important role in. And therefore, you know, what is going to happen? I think the Democrats are interested in moving on some of those issues, which I'd be happy to identify if we want to get into that. But I worry about the Republican Party. I worry about it.
That's a first.
No, but seriously, it's become so powerful, partly because of the impact I think the Kochs have had with their massive network of strengthening it, both at the, not just the federal, but at all the state levels. And I worry about their influence. I worry about the potential resurgence of what's never far from the surface in Republican politics, the militarism, the Cheney school of thought, the Project for a New American Century, all those ideas that dominated in the George W. Bush era and that brought us the devastation of the invasion of Iraq, which, let's not forget, is every bit as bad as anything Donald Trump has done. And it's so important, I think, as we look about going forward, to try and figure out where this very powerful, incredibly wealthy party will be trying to take the American public. And I think the influence of the Koch brothers in fighting climate change, for instance, and the influence of the other stream, the militarist stream, if you want to call it that, in promoting more wars. I think these are incredibly important considerations.
So where does that leave the Republican Party? What's the prognosis for, I mean, Bob,
Well,
what do you think?
First of all, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Second of all, I have no idea who's going to win the next election in the United States, any more than I know for sure who's going to win the next election in Canada. And we could argue about that for a long time. It wouldn't be very productive. I do think that the U.S., after Trump, is going to have to come to grips with what is going to be a very damaging reality, that the world is a much more complicated and difficult place than I think the president realizes. I think his approaches are very simplistic and, as I've said, very impulsive. They're not thought through in terms of the consequences. I mean, you don't start. I mean, he's tweeted very publicly saying, trade wars are easy. I win, you lose. Well, no, trade wars are actually a lot easier to start than they are to stop. And once you get into this cycle of, you do this, I'll do that, you do this, I'll do that, at some point you say somebody's going to have a great deal of difficulty climbing down. And when that happens, or doesn't happen, we're all going to pay a huge price for it in terms of what happens to the economy. We can think that the people who are losing $600 billion in the stock market are a whole lot of really wealthy people who've got a lot of money in the market. But frankly, looking at this audience here and out to those who are listening and watching, we all have a stake in the market. All our pension funds are connected to the market. Everything we count on in terms of the stability of our economic life is dependent on what's taking place in the marketplace, as well as what governments do. So yeah, the Republicans are going to have a hard time picking up the pieces. So are Democrats. So are liberals and conservatives and labor and conservative and every political party in the modern world. It's going to be a deeply challenging situation. But what we need to learn how to do, and I've mentioned this a couple of times, is how can we learn how to think more consequentially about what we are doing? And to me, Trump is the classic example of the dangers of an impulsive personality. You call it narcissistic or whatever you want to call it. I've never met anybody in politics who didn't have a little bit of that tendency.
Oh, Bob, you didn't.
Oh, well. There are people in this audience who can speak otherwise. But I mean, I think it's really important for us to appreciate that what to me the most novel and dangerous feature of Trump is this crazy impulsiveness that just leads him to think, I'm going to do this. You know, yesterday or the other day we were, you know, a tweet came out that said, I hereby order all companies to disinvest from China and bring their manufacturing back home or somewhere else. You sort of say, do you have any idea how many companies are totally dependent, not just on manufacturing in China, but manufacturing in China for the Chinese market? Do you have any idea what would happen to General Motors and Ford and all of the companies that are engaged in manufacturing if they suddenly said, yeah, you're right, President, we work for you, and you're our boss, and we're going to come. You sort of say, even in the most incredible moments of irrationality, I can't imagine any other political leader just saying, I hereby order. I mean, you know, I was a first minister, and if I said, I hereby order, you say, hey, what would you like for breakfast, Mr. Ray? Would you like...
Yeah, but you weren't
How do you
the
want
chosen
your eggs?
one.
I mean, it's a different thing.
Well,
David, you wanted to weigh in?
okay, let me pick up on two things that are sort of in the air that I think might be, I could usefully add something to. The first is, while you're worrying about the Republican Party, please understand this is an infection to which no political grouping is immune. That authoritarian populism has left-wing as well as right-wing variants. And the Jeremy Corbyn cult in Britain is an example of this. I mean, how you make a cult out of someone as completely mediocre as Jeremy Corbyn, I do not understand. Just a complete vacancy. But at so many points, his detestation of the independent press, his contempt for parliamentary institutions as they exist in Britain, and his ability to create a following that cuts across the traditional lines of politics. What we are seeing everywhere, where there are multi-party systems, are the withering of traditional social democratic parties. The German Social Democratic Party, once the single most powerful party in terms of membership on earth, in the democratic world, it's coming in fourth and fifth place in German state elections. As its voters desert it, they split. Basically, the ones whose grandparents were German end up inside these new authoritarian populist parties, and the ones whose grandparents come from somewhere else end up inside the Greens or the left or some other thing. But that's happening all over the world. And the Democratic Party in the United States is not immune. And I think one of the things that is sort of striking about it is that in order to find a candidate who represents the big Democratic coalition of the past, they have to reach someone who's actually older than the baby boomers. Joe Biden was born in 1942 or 43. And you thought, you know, we're now going from after what we thought was the last baby boomer president in Trump to the last pre-baby boomer president, possibly in Biden. But that reflects that if the Democrats look forward, that they see they are also buffeted by these changes. I want to say something about the Iraq wars, in which I had a small role. I think as history is going to look back on it, we are going to see the Iraq War as the last episode of the 20th century and not the first episode of the 21st. The Iraq War, the second Iraq War as we should call it, was authorized by a United Nations resolution. The Bush administration had a vote in Congress to authorize the use of force, and it was led by a multinational coalition. And whatever you think of the merits of what happened there, that it was, I think, the last expression of American foreign policy ideas as they had existed since the end of World War II. That the United States tries to uphold an international order and tries to do so with the consent of its domestic political institutions and with the support of allies. I think the failure of the Iraq War discredited a lot of those concepts outside the United States and inside the United States. And since then, what you see, and this is, I think, the hallmark both of the Obama foreign policy as sort of a small appetizer course, and then the Trump mania is we don't work with allies anymore. We work entirely unilaterally. We are not here as a preserver of an international order from which we profit. We are a rogue agent within the international order. And so you have the crazy spectacle where the American alliance system in Northeast Asia is disintegrating as Japan and Korea cancel their intelligence sharing operations and are increasingly hostile, Japan and South Korea, with each other, and in which China is inviting the leaders of Japan and South Korea to come to Beijing to settle their differences. What you see is America obviously will remain a very, very powerful state, but the system of alliances, which fought the Iraq War, was also a casualty of the Iraq War, and we are into a new chapter post-Iraq. I see it as a real, that's the decision moment in my mind.
Bob and then Linda.
I'd like
Or
to.
Linda and then
Oh,
Bob.
I guess it's Linda and then
Please.
Bob. No, go
Yeah,
ahead.
Go ahead, yeah. Please.
No, I would like to believe the Iraq War was the end of something. I fear that kind of militarism and that kind of willingness to go in and overthrow governments is not something that's likely to go away. We see it already with, even in the Trump administration, with the interest in regime change in Venezuela, possibly whatever they're thinking about regime change in Iran. I don't think those ideas are gone. In fact, I think they are endemic in a certain segment of the American population. And it's not about putting in place democracies around the world, supporting values that we care about. The whole Middle Eastern fiasco in many ways goes back to 1953, when the US and Britain overthrew a democratically elected government in Iran, the Mossadegh government, because he'd nationalized Iranian oil and installed a brutal dictator, the Shah, and by the way, had the impact of Shah was incredibly oppressive, drove out all kinds, absolutely clamped down on opposition. So as a result of that, the only place that people could meet that were resisting the Shah in any way was in the mosques. And so that became the sort of central focus of the resistance movement, and you can see where that got off the rails. So my point is, I don't think this is something new in American politics. I would like to believe that the Iraq War was the end of it, and I don't know where you got the idea there was some kind of UN support. I seem to recall a coalition of the willing because the UN wouldn't go along. I think what that is all about is there's a segment of the American population, and it's in all parties, but it happens to be most pronounced in the Republican Party, that believes in American supremacy. They recognize the U.S. as the most powerful country in the world, and particularly after the end of the demise of the Soviet Union, they see that as an opportunity to consolidate American control over the world and to basically take premeditative, or preemptive action against any country that they consider in any way challenging them. I don't think that mentality has gone away. I think it's very much a danger.
Bob.
Well, I'm not sure how useful it is to refight the Iraq War, but I do think that what David and Linda are really now talking about is, well, how can we usefully go forward? If we think more about, well, what is the international order going to look like, and how is it going to work? And I think that that's actually a very difficult but very necessary question. And it isn't going to be easy. We've already heard differing views about, well, when do you intervene? When do you not intervene? It's important to remember that this whole notion of responsibilities to protect and the importance of human security, which was very much part of Canadian foreign policy in the 1990s and very much part of our efforts to build arguments in favor of trying to protect human rights and trying to protect people, was used by the Bush administration and by Tony Blair as the reason why they intervened in Iraq. And Canada felt at that time that was not justified. It didn't, in fact, have the UN sanction. It didn't, in fact, have the support of a specific resolution authorizing a military intervention. And so we now have to recognize that intervention is a really hard thing to do. You don't export democracy like a refrigerator. It's not that easy. These values are hard to find, and you're entering into conflicts, as every imperial power has discovered over the last few thousand years, that you're entering into conflicts that are far more complex, far more difficult, and very difficult to change and to say, well, here's the democratic group that we're going to support, and these guys are going to be able to create a liberal democracy sort of like ours. Well, hello, that hasn't really worked. But at the same time, you can't just pull back and say, well, human rights don't matter. And how people treat each other doesn't matter. So the work of trying to build effective alliances that will deal with the challenges we face is in fact very, very hard to do. But there's no option but to do it. That's on the political side. On the economic side, we need to understand that it's another instance where we're living in a world without adult supervision. And we were all used to, I mean, Canadians we took for granted that when we were thinking about, well, how are we going to manage this? We would talk to the British, and we would talk to the French, and we would talk to the Americans. But above all, we would look to the White House for leadership. Well, I mean, I'm involved in a file now involving refugees. And there are millions of people in refugee camps around the world. That number is growing. It's exploding. Where is American leadership on this? It isn't there.
I know you have questions, but
Please.
just a brief thought on all of this.
Sure.
The defining characteristic of the US-led world order that comes to being with the Atlantic Charter, but really after 1945 and the victory of World War II, was not intervention. It was the provision of security. The Americans took the view, we are so secure and we are so rich, we will give you all security for free. That Donald Trump keeps complaining that Germany no longer has an army, Japan no longer has a navy. That was not a bug in the post-1945 order. That was a feature. I said, you guys concentrate on making beautiful cars and domestic appliances, and we will give you the army for free. And to the Japanese, you concentrate on what you do best, and we'll give you the navy for free because these knives could hurt people. And the United States also did was it maintained an international economic architecture, a free trade order, in which the United States said to the Germans and Japanese, you can, and then later to the Asia-Pacific countries, you guys can undervalue your currencies a little bit and get great trade surpluses, and we can afford that. Where Donald Trump is really an inflection point, and where his successor, whoever that person should be, and whatever party they should come from, will be a continuation, is that he has said no to both of those things. The United States will no longer be a security exporter. It is going to act for itself. And it will no longer be a provider of this system of trade. I mean, Donald Trump, in 2016, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton insincerely, but both were against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The most dynamic candidates in the Democratic Party in 2020, Elizabeth Warren and the others, not Joe Biden because he's from the past, but the others, they're also against the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The idea the United States is going to build this and uphold this trade architecture and maybe take some sacrifices to make it work. That's the world in which we all grew up, and that world, whatever happens to Trump, is gone. And that is a very frightening thing. And Linda does not want to live in a world built on American supremacy. We all lived in that world since 1945. Wait till you see the world without American supremacy. It is going to be a much more frightening place.
We're in that world now, but just a word about the past. You can't not talk about, as Linda did quite rightly, about Iran. You can't not talk about Vietnam. You can't not talk about Latin America. You can't not talk about a whole bunch of other surrogate wars that went on throughout the period between 1945 and 1960, and realize that they were in fact a period of intervention, sometimes in the name of democracy, in the name of a variety of things. But to suggest that somehow there was this benign world in which there was no intervention, there were no fights, there were no battles, I mean, that isn't a reality. That's
Who said that?
Well, you implied it when you said there was the post-war order was nothing about intervention. It
Well,
wasn't part about. No, David, just a minute. You interrupted me. Let me just interrupt you. It was about intervention in part. I'm not denying the other two features of the order, and I'm not denying that that order is gone. I think it's important for us to understand it. But it does also mean that we need to appreciate, when we look to how we're going to do things in the future, we need to understand all of the elements of what was missing before and how challenging it is to go forward.
Linda.
And also, I think, David, you've made it, the order sound a little bit benign, with the idea that the U.S. was simply trying to provide security so everybody be okay. Actually, that's what the UN was supposed to do. What the U.S. did was provide a Pax Americana in which it was dominant, and if you were on its side, didn't matter how brutal you were, Saudi Arabia qualified, but if, as being a friend, then you got full U.S. support. If you were offside with the U.S., you didn't get very good support, and you could end up being overthrown. You know, it's funny because the U.S. always tries to project that what they are is kind of a defensive force, kind of against aggression around the world. They always, I mean, the U.S. is something like 800 military bases around the world. You know, just around Iran alone, there's something like 40 bases. I love the line somebody said, you know, Iran is obviously wanting war. Otherwise, why would they locate themselves in the middle of all those U.S. bases?
Finished, yeah. Thank you for that. I thank you also for all these great questions. I just want to apologize in advance that we'll never get to all of these. I'll just kind of get a sense of what people are asking and present those. But I do want to get to sort of back up a point. And Iraq was one thing, and it's a big thing. But I just wonder if we could speak briefly about what else, because I think we all know that the underlying reasons for the rise of populism, whether Trump or otherwise, is a general dissatisfaction with the current state of Western democracy. And I just wonder how else liberal democracy has failed to deliver. Linda, if you don't mind starting.
I mean, first of all, I do think this rise of fake populism, as I call it, is a real phenomenon and a real danger. And I think it comes out of the fact that people, in the post-war years, there was a much more equal distribution of wealth and income, and much more satisfaction. I think in what's happened in the sort of neoliberal era, basically since 1980, as more and more of the money has ended up at the top, and people are angry, by that, and there's been an effective attempt by the right to sort of say, oh, it's not that the rich got away with all that money, recasting the tax laws and trade laws in their own benefit, labor laws. What happened was you got all these immigrants coming in.
But immigration was the proximate cause. It's the trigger everywhere.
No,
I mean,
well, it's maybe the proximate cause of the neo-populism, but it isn't the cause of the dissatisfaction.
It is the proximate cause of the rise of these authoritarian regimes. I mean, if Angela Merkel had been able to do something different in the August of 2015, and she had some, but her decision to open the borders of Germany to this influx of about 1.25 million people, about half from Syria, half from other places, that's what elected the Kaczynski government in Poland. That was what drove Brexit. That was the most powerful argument. When you study the polls of why did Brexit win, I mean, Britain has had a deeply unhappy relationship with the European Union for a long time, but the thing that got you that last segment of approval that made them say yes instead of no, as they'd often said in the past, was the mass migration. Mass migration, the surge of across the borders in 2014 in the United States, in the southern border of the United States, that's a proximate cause of the election of Donald Trump. And what is driving this, and this problem is not going to become easier to manage. We have this idea, or it's often suggested, that what drives the mass migration is misery and despair. That's not true, because the miserable and despair, it is not true, because they can't.
Some would argue with that.
They can't afford it. To move from the Middle East to Europe, you have to, from North Africa, you have to pay a people smuggler somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000, which in the context, to move from Central America to the United States is about $5,000. The Angolans who are showing up have paid about $10,000. what we have now is the rise of this, as world poverty shrinks, the rise of what I call a global striver class. People not living in poverty, less than $2 a day, but living on $15 to $20 a day. And what you can buy things they can never buy before, air conditioners and mobile phones. And one of the things they want to buy is migration to a country that offers better opportunity. And so you have, so it has been since 1990, the period of the greatest increase in prosperity in the history of our planet, also is the greatest increase in migration in the history of our planet, because the prosperity buys the migration.
Well,
And-
some of those people are coming from
Well, and the
air
United Nations
conditioners.
does say that there are 60 million people on the move who are moved by conflict and by
And,
Yeah,
and
but-
let's
but
not
the- but the-
forget,
that are beyond
the
let's
their
not
UN
control.
forget
UN
how
does.
many of those people from the Middle East were refugees as a result of the destabilization caused by the invasion of Iraq.
What the UN figures conflate are the numbers of people who, driven by war or drought or environmental disaster, move immediately away from the disaster. That is what most of the people from Syria did. They moved to the next place because it's expensive, versus those who move half a continent away. That costs money. And so the people who are showing up from Southwest Africa in Italy are not people going to the next place. They are people who have invested, are making some money. They're people of some substance back home. And it's part of and by the way, of course, we'd all do the same thing if that had been our fate. But
Well, our grandparents did.
we would all do the same thing. But
We
but
wouldn't be here.
but there are a lot of things that are in the same way we all run our air conditioners. But when you have 7 billion people all running your air conditioners, things happen that don't happen when only 1 million people are running.
I think we
air
can have an
conditioners.
entire separate debate on that, absolutely. But if we could just pull it back to the failures of liberal democracy, and of course I take your point
It's
that was
it's
a
probably the
major
most immediate.
driver in populist resurgence. But Linda,
Can I
maybe
just say,
come back
you know,
to the point.
The rise of this populism, ugly right-wing populism, that is one huge problem. That's not the only problem. Like, I think we should be focused on, there's these serious existential threats to the survival of the human race. Climate change, nuclear war, the absolute destruction of the environment. Those are the sort of three major ones. What are we going to be doing to address those issues? You know,
Bob.
Well, I think Linda, in posing those questions, also, in a sense, says, well, how can liberal democracy find definitive answers to those things quickly? And I think part of what David is describing, and I don't completely disagree with him about what are the forces that drive people to move from different places at different times. And we are certainly in one of those periods where there's a great deal of migration going on. Historically, there have been other periods when that's what's happened. We wouldn't be Canada if that isn't what happened to all our ancestors in terms of coming to this land, which they all thought was uninhabited, but we actually had a lot of people living here before anybody else got here. But liberal democracy has a challenge dealing with these questions for two reasons. One of them is it's really difficult. Second one is actually global warming or climate change is actually a planetary problem, and we don't have a planetary government. The United Nations is not a government. It's a big bureaucracy, but it's not a government, and it's really hard right now to find planetary solutions to what is a very real problem affecting people living around the world and is having a very direct impact. No one for a moment, I think, a few people accepted, will deny the reality of climate change. But
the entire Republican Party.
Well, no, but I mean, let's...
Pretty important group.
I'm just saying, in rational circles, that's not the way things work. But that's not to say that finding the solutions is easy, or that in the solutions that we adopt, that you can then say, as an elected politician, knock on the door, which I suspect I've done a little bit more than either of my people on the panel. You knock on the door, and people will say, yeah, but if I pay more, or if gasoline costs more, or if something else, is that going to actually change the climate? And the answer to that question is no. because what happens to the climate depends on the collective action of governments, 200 governments around the world, and also an industrial and economic change, the like of which we haven't seen in a very short space of time ever.
But don't you
When
think
people say what Linda just said, which is the climate problem is more important than the problem of authoritarian populism. That's a little bit like being on an airplane that's out of control. And I say, all the instruments are broken and the steering mechanism isn't working. And the person says, that's not our real problem. Our real problem is that we're heading straight for a mountain. Well, you're not going to escape the mountain unless the steering mechanism on the plane is working. Especially with climate requires that a lot of ordinary people trust the insight of scientists and experts who have often steered them wrong. I mean, just think of the major decision, of the major smart ideas that people have had since people with who wear suits and ties, people who hold themselves out as experts since 1990. How many of them have worked out well from the point of view of the great majority? Or, we can make mortgage security safer by chopping them up and securitizing them. A lot of smart people thought that was a very good idea. And
that's different than the
but
entire body of world scientists.
You're asking people don't believe doctors about vaccinations, or a significant number do.
No.
You're asking them to trust authority, and then you're asking them to make sacrifices. And those things are things that people, it's easy for us to say they should do it, but when they don't, you can't address the problem. And so these authoritarian populist movements exploit the distrust of expertise.
Yeah,
They
absolutely.
exploit the breakdown of political institutions, and those things have to be restored if you're going to address any of these larger problems.
I agree with that. At the same time, I think it's misleading to imply that sort of ordinary people are not willing to get on board with doing something about climate change. I think particularly in the last year, you're seeing a huge change. You're seeing polls. People get it. They understand flooding and drought. And I think what you're leaving out is the particular role that's played by something like Koch Industries in absolutely blocking, attempting to create such confusion in the public's mind, with this climate denial. We knew, scientists have known at least since 1988 the breadth of the problem, the seriousness of it, and it's been the resistance, the absolute resistance by big oil, big coal, the Koch brothers, whoever, in blocking, trying to throw all this doubt through all their think tanks. And people want information, they want scientific facts, but there's been this whole attempt at disinformation. I think that's an enormous part of the story.
But that's not new in any political conflict, in any economic conflict, in any debate about ideas. It's always going to be contested. I think the challenge that we face, we have to understand better that getting to a different place from where we are today in terms of what this world order will look like is actually really tough. And it's not going to just sort of happen automatically, or say, well, we'll let the UN do it, or we're going to establish an international rule of law that will make sure these things all change. The world is more complicated, and it's more challenging and difficult. And I think that one of the things that's really hard for people who are hurting as a result of all of the uncertainties that they're facing, to suddenly say, yeah, I'm prepared to make this sacrifice, although I have no idea whether or not it's going to be effective. And very few political leaders are honest enough to say to people, well, here's what we think is going to help. But actually, in order for things to be effective, a whole lot of other countries have to change as well. And we have no guarantees that they're going to change. So here we go. Now, I think that's one of the reasons why liberal democracy is as challenged as it is, because it's very difficult for leaders to say those things, and it's very difficult for a public to accept the notion that collectively we're going to have to do some things that are not easy and that are not going to have an immediate payback and are not necessarily going to be good for my generation, but maybe good for future generations.
No, but
But that's asking a lot of people.
Bob,
I just
nobody
want to
thought-
jump in here and take some of the questions from the audience, if we could, and also to bring it back to the point that you brought up, Bob, about the failures of liberal democracy and what some of the solutions might be. Anyway, these questions are a bit off that topic, but they're important. Here's one. Should Trump fail to win re-election? And this is a great question. If he fails to win re-election, what would be the 5 lead stories in American news?
The 5 leads.
The 5 most important issues. I mean, it's actually an issue that comes up even in our lives. I went and spoke on a panel once where we were talking about global citizenship, and we had an hour and a half of discussion about this, and suddenly the first question comes up, and it was for me, and they said, what can we do to stop the media covering Mr. Trump? And some people have had enough. And so the question to you is, where do you think that the emphasis would be if it weren't on, what is coming out of the White House? David.
Well, let's suppose Donald Trump does lose in 2020, and let's say he leaves office and doesn't do too much damage on the way out the door. So now it's sometime in the summer of 2021. So the number one story will be, because if he leaves office, the reason he will leave office is because the stock market troubles indicate that a recession is on the way. So the first problem will be inside the United States, the American economic downturn. The second issue will be the shock of migration, because there's this great pressure as the American economy did prosper between 2014 and 2019. It pulled migration. As the American economy softens, that migration will be more resented. And people around the world will see the fall of Donald Trump as the doors open signal, and you'll have more migration even as the economy softens. So that'll be issue 2. I agree with Lyndon. Obviously, the climate issue, the past 5 years have seen more extreme weather events inside the United States than the previous 20. I presume those are going to continue to afflict people in all kinds of ways. That's going to be an issue. We're also going to have huge issues about fiscal sustainability as the baby boomers I'm the last of the baby boomers. I was born in 1960. As we all begin to qualify, 58 was the peak year. So the people born in 1958 begin to qualify for these benefits in 2023. Huge strain on Social Security and Medicare. And I think we also are going to, Donald Trump's mishandling of the rise of China does not make this problem any less important. Since 1900, liberal democracies have contended with a series of challenges. But the last, from countries that were both sometimes economically capable, sometimes militarily capable. The last time you had a challenge from a country that was both economically capable and militarily capable was the Kaiser's Germany in 1917, 1918. We have not seen that particular combination in a long time. With China, for the first time since the Kaiser, we see it again.
Okay. And another question, Linda, maybe you can tackle this one. What will be the most enduring damage to American democracy that stems out of the Trump's presidency?
Wow, let me count the ways.
Just pick the top one.
It's fascinating because thinking about coming here today, I was sort of making up a list of all the terrible things he'd done. It really is a long list. And then I realized when I got to the end, oh my God, I forgot corruption. There's so much other stuff. In a way, I think a lot of these problems will probably correct themselves or be corrected by a new government that doesn't indulge them. I don't think the Democrats are going to continue to vilify the free press, that kind of thing, and continue to lie in the scale that Donald Trump has. I guess one possible enduring thing that really worries me is the incitement to racism and white supremacy. I mean, that whole problem goes to the very root of what America was founded on, the fundamental problem of slavery at the very heart of the American system, and the contradiction between the idea, the land of freedom, where you had millions of people enslaved, and the very idea that Trump has played so fast and loose trying to, obviously the problem is that a lot of that white supremacy, hatred of the other, never went away in American politics. It kind of got dealt with in some ways after the Civil War. At the same time, there was the revival of Jim Crow up until very recently. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates did that wonderful piece in The Atlantic a couple of years ago about the case for reparations, and sort of making the case that it didn't just disappear after slavery and Jim Crow. This continues up to the present time. It's absolutely at the root of the problem of America. And Trump, earlier politicians have sometimes done dog whistles out there to sort of revive these feelings to their political advantage. But Trump has done it in an openly provocative way to stir up and excite the Nazis and white supremacists. And they've been stirred. And I find it frightening to imagine that problem going forward as a lasting legacy of Trump.
Did you want to add something, or can I ask you a question?
Ask me a question.
Okay. So given that people are tired of old-fashioned models of democracy, I just wonder, people want a voice, they want, they know that the idea of party politics is not what it used to be. Are there models out there for what might be done to give people an opportunity to reshape party politics, to reshape the way they can advance their voice in this environment?
Well, yes, but it's not easy, and it requires, and this is the main reason it's not easy is because it requires exceptional discipline on the part of politicians themselves, in being willing to listen, in being willing to hear, and in being willing to admit the possibility that they've been wrong. And those are very difficult things to do. And I think we see it all the time, that it's very difficult for politicians to say, well, I used to think that, but I was wrong when I said that, and now I think this, because I've been listening to what people have been telling me. How often do you hear people say that? I mean, forget Trump. I mean, we know that's not going to happen, but even among the rest of us, is that something that's possible? We can create different models of, in Canada, there's been a debate for a long time about, can we inject some greater degree of proportional representation? That has not happened for a whole variety of reasons, and either at the provincial level. We see, for example, in the province of Ontario, municipal governance being treated like playthings, and borders being changed, boundaries being changed, representation being taken away. That can change, but it requires a provincial government and leadership saying, we accept the fact that there will be lots of municipal councils that will have different views from our government. And they may even have different priorities, but we're prepared to let that happen. And we're prepared to take a step back. And that is a different political culture than the one that we have today. And talking about, what has been the permanent impact, what is the impact in what's happened in the United States and happening in other countries and happening here. It's a change in a political culture in a way that is just not healthy. It's not actually sustainable, and it's not good, but that's what there is. So how do we change it? It's difficult, because you're asking people who've grown up in a system to do things differently, and that's tough. But I don't think we have an option. If we want to salvage a degree of democracy and representation, that's what needs to happen. It doesn't avoid dealing with difficult questions. And I actually don't disagree with David about what are the big issues that we're going to be facing. We are facing serious issues about the economy. We're facing very difficult issues about sustainability. Yes, of course, immigration will continue to be a question. I disagree with him a bit about how massive an issue this is going to be, but it's going to be a global issue of some considerable importance. And I think those things are tough for any collection of people to say, how are we going to solve this or deal with it? But we have to go into it with a very different spirit about humility, about admitting, as I said, the possibility that we've made serious mistakes, and then saying, and now I'd like to go forward. Speaking very personally, I mean, again, having been elected and unelected, I know what that's like, and it can be quite humbling, if not humiliating, but it's something you have to go through. And I think if you have that spirit in you as a political leader, and you also need to have a public that's willing to accept the fact that no leaders are perfect. And none are imperfect, and all have flaws. And so you're not choosing between this guy is perfect, the chosen one, and everyone else is that kind of binary way of looking at people in the world is just, if I may borrow a phrase from the Danish Prime Minister, absurd. And so...
Dave.
So nasty.
And nasty.
David.
May I answer that question and offer maybe a more hopeful note? Because this has not been a super hopeful conversation. But
I don't agree. It's quite hopeful.
I have a hopeful thought, and it's just a thought. We look back on the political leadership of the quarter century after the war, and it's not just hazy romanticism to say that political leadership was more successful. In many countries, and built this infrastructure of stability that we all grew up under. They weren't better than us. What was different? And the difference was, well, they had lived through the experience of seeing the world tumble off the brink of depression and into World War, and they had experienced as a new idea the shock of the possibility of nuclear holocaust. And so, in almost every democracy, leaders undertook self-restraint. They never played the game as hard as they could play it. Unions and management, right and left, they all understood, we have all seen what happened when everyone played the game as hard as they could. Let's not. And that knowledge inevitably tended to fade, and especially with the end of the Cold War and the relaxation of this terrible pressure from Soviet totalitarianism, nuclear armed. In every country, people began to play the game more harshly after 1990 than they did before. It is possible, and this is what I devoutly hope, that maybe you don't have to tumble over the brink to have that experience. Maybe you can have some of the benefit just from seeing the brink. And Trump and Brexit and a series of experiences like that, I am hopeful that the generation of politicians that comes to the fore after these experiences may say, it was not obviously 1930, 1945, but it was pretty bad. And what we all need to do is we all need to communicate to our supporters that as hard as you press us to go to the extremities, we will not do it, because we want to play the game in a different kind of way. I've used a series of metaphors. Here's one that I think Trump is like that moment. At best, he may be like this, where you're on the highway and you're driving and your attention wanders and you suddenly realize you've been drifting. And then you see the headlights of the oncoming truck, and you pull back into your lane, and the pulse of adrenaline gets you safely home. I am hoping that he's like that truck, and that he's going to give us all a surge of adrenaline that gets us safely home.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice image. I like that. I guess I would just say, though, and this is in the spirit of being hopeful, too, that I think one of the problems, we have this whole disenfranchised labor, ordinary people, whatever you want to call them, unemployed miners, who are not doing nearly as well as they did in that post-war era that we grew up in, which was more prosperous for everyone. In recent years, the benefits have gone more to the top. But here's my optimism, that, after the Trump horror of this brutal, deep tax cut that is so favorable to the rich and does nothing for anyone else, we now have kind of opened the door, like as David says, we've kind of swerved off and maybe we're going to find our balance and listen to people like Elizabeth Warren, who are proposing a wealth tax of 2% on fortunes above 50 million, going to 3% for billionaires. I guess my point is that I think maybe the time has come to consider that. Thomas Piketty, the big economist who wrote the Capital in the 21st Century, points out that Elizabeth Warren's ideas for taxing the rich are actually quite in line with the historical higher rates on taxing the rich in the U.S. that we've gone so far away from because of Reagan and Bush, and now and now Trump, and that there's room to get back to that, and that would be so good in terms of greater equality.
Unfortunately, we're just about out of time, but one last quick question to you, Bob, if you don't mind. Can the U.S. go back to an earlier brand of business as usual, U.S. and everyone else, frankly, once Trump moves on, or is the model irretrievably broken?
No, I think the remodel has to be whatever we do is not about going back to something. My suspicion would be that if Mr. Trump is defeated in 2020, it could be by candidate Biden and then President Biden, and he will give everyone a sense that we can go back. It's we're back to where we were. Let's start up again. And in fact, there's too many things going on that make that hard to do. It's now clear to us after the events of the last few months that there's something rotten outside the state of Denmark, and
Okay.
it'll slowly grow on you. It'll slowly grow on you. But no, we can't. No, we can't actually go backwards. We can only go forward. And I don't think it's being less hopeful to say it's going to be a big challenge. And one of the things that we have to give up is that that all we have to do is get back to the way things were in 1955 and everything will be okay. That ain't going to happen. So you then have to say, what does it take to build? And I think it takes, yes, dealing with economic justice issues. It takes, yes, dealing with social justice issues. Yes, it means dealing with the challenges of a new diplomatic order. And it really does mean dealing with sustainability and climate change in a way that we have not yet been able to do, either as countries or as a world order.
We only have 15 seconds left. The same question. You think it's broken, or can we go back to business as usual?
We don't want to go. I completely agree with Bob Wright. We don't want to go back to the way it was. We're not going back to a world of big industry. Linda mentioned unemployed coal miners. The total employment in the coal industry is smaller than the number of registered yoga instructors
Yeah,
in
but
the
they're
United
very
States.
politically influential. That's the point.
That it's a new economy. And we don't want to go back to mining coal and having people work on assembly lines. That was terrible. I mean, parents sacrificed so their kids could go to college. They wouldn't have to do that anymore. We have to. The opportunities now to solve the problems of our time, they are also exciting, and we should take those. It's going to take a different kind of politics. It's going to take new kind of leaderships, but it's really possible. Last thought: I am so often asked to make predictions. And I refuse to do that, not just because of the risk of being wrong, although I'm mindful of that, but because predictions treat the future as a thing that exists, that you can see and make observations about. It doesn't exist. We all make it. So the thought that we should all take away today is it's in our hands. What are we going to do? And if we decide right, if we decide better, if we are more generous, if we are better citizens, we can make it better.
Thank you very much to the panel for their excellent insights. And thank you for listening. Thank you very much. Julie.
Again, I want to say thank you to Linda, Bob, and David for your thoughts and your optimism this morning. I think it was almost a standing ovation. It's very exciting.
It's not too late.
And I also wanted to
they're
thank.
going to be standing up to leave anyway.
I also wanted to thank Nahlah. It has been a pleasure welcoming you as a new host of CBC Ideas, and it's been a delight working with you this summer. All of our guests have books for sale in the lobby today, which is exciting for all of you. And everyone will be available in the lobby to sign books after I stop talking. So I encourage you to visit that on your way out. The Meighen Forum continues all season long with inspiring guests and excellent discussions, and we have an excellent speaker weekend coming up in September. On September 14th, the Right Honourable David Johnston, former Governor-General of Canada, sits down with Anthony Tumolino to discuss his new book, Trust, 20 Ways to Build a Better Country. And on September 15th, internationally award-winning photographer and explorer and scholar Wade Davis joins David Goldblum for a candid conversation about his life and work. Thank you again to our guests, and thank you to you for your continued support of the Meighen Forum. Thank you.
Thank you.